This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
Thank you for joining us once again in our series of lessons on the Sermon on the Mount. We're in Matthew chapters 5 through 7, of course. That's the entire sermon. We're going to be looking in this session in chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, which we'll look at momentarily. But throughout the sermon that we've been studying, Jesus has painted a picture of what a citizen of His kingdom would look like. And throughout this series, if you've watched the previous videos, you've noticed how we've been emphasizing that because that's what Jesus was emphasizing. The theme of the sermon had to do with the kingdom and what a person who is a part of that kingdom would be, what their characteristics would be. And so we've looked through that, and if you were to go back and just kind of summarize many of those lessons, when we looked at the Beatitudes, all of those different attitudes that people would have, poverty of spirit and meekness and things like that. And a person, a kingdom citizen would have a proper relationship to the laws of God, the commandments of God, from chapter 5, verses 17 and following. And they would watch attitudes like anger and lust and try to alleviate those, and they'd have proper respect for marriage and God's marriage law, all kinds of things that we've looked at that had to do with what a kingdom citizen would look like. Well, we're now approaching the end of the sermon, and now beginning in verse 13, Jesus is going to make kind of a transition. And He's not going to be speaking so much about characteristics of one who is a part of the kingdom, but He's going to talk about now what it takes to become a part of the kingdom. And so we're going to look at the final few sections of the sermon in 3 lessons, beginning with this one and then 2 more to follow that will conclude the series. But in those 3 lessons, we're going to emphasize what Jesus does in the sermon about becoming a citizen of the kingdom. And there are principles involved in that. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. And so we're going to start with this principle from verses 13 and 14. And that is that if a person is going to be a part of the kingdom, he has to first recognize and understand what's at stake. And with that as a foundation, then you can move beyond that to actual additional steps to take to become a part of the kingdom. But this is first. We've got to recognize how important it is. We've got to recognize what's at stake. And so let's look at Matthew 7, verses 13 and 14, and then we will draw some lessons from that. Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. So Jesus talks about now an entrance into a particular, or through a particular gate that you access through a particular road or way. And actually he talks about two gates and 2 ways. And in this, Jesus is going to emphasize how important it is to be a part of the kingdom, because there are eternal ramifications to our choice as to how we live and whether or not we enter into the kingdom. And so let's consider these points in that respect. And first thing to think about is the fact that entrance into the kingdom of Christ is, in one sense, not easy. Entrance into the kingdom of Christ, in one sense, is not easy. Jesus says in verse 13 that we are to enter by what He refers to as the narrow gate. That word narrow in verse 13 simply means restricted. He'll refer to the way in which we get to that gate in verse 14 as difficult. Difficult is the way that leads to life. And that word difficult is a word that refers to something that causes suffering, something that causes hardship. And so both of those terms, narrow and difficult, leave the obvious impression that entering into the kingdom and ultimately into the kingdom in its eternal state is in some ways not very easy. Jesus did not sugarcoat His message in this respect and in any other context. Jesus never did that. He never promised anyone that being a citizen of His kingdom would cause a person to be exempt from all forms of difficulty. Jesus never promised that to anyone. Matter of fact, even in the Sermon on the Mount, sections that we've already studied, Jesus spoke about difficult things. And I want to call your attention to those in the sermon. If you want to look back to these passages, we'll see the different difficult things that Jesus said would be a part of His kingdom. Look in chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. In the Beatitudes, Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." There's a statement of difficulty. Jesus said, if you want to be a citizen of the kingdom, it's going to involve persecution, difficulty. You're going to be mistreated, and all for my sake. So that's certainly not going to be easy or enjoyable. Look further in the sermon. Look at verse 22 of Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus talks about anger. "But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. Whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hell fire." That's a difficult thing to control one's anger and temper. That can be hard for a person to do. What about verses 28 through 30 of chapter 5? "But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell." If you haven't seen the lesson that we did in this series on that section, I encourage you to watch that. But just by way of summary, Jesus is using figurative language. By figurative, I mean He's using hyperbole, exaggeration for the sake of emphasis, when He talks about plucking out your eye or cutting off your hand. But the stringency of what He teaches there doesn't need to be lost in the figurative language. He's saying it can require, to be a citizen of my kingdom, it can require very difficult sacrifices. Sacrificing whatever you need to in order to have a pure and sincere heart. So that sometimes involves things that are not easy. How about verse 32 of chapter 5? "But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery." You know, that's pretty strict teaching when it comes to divorce and remarriage. And we did a lesson that involved a further explanation of all of that. And we talked about how many people aren't willing to accept that today. Now, Jesus doesn't change simply because people aren't willing to accept what He's taught. But my point in this lesson is it's difficult. Some people may have to make major sacrifices in this regard to be faithful to the Lord and faithful to His teaching. And then one more example of difficulty in verse 44 of Matthew 5. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. So when Jesus says in Matthew 7, back to our text for this session, when He says that difficult is the way that leads to life, and enter by the narrow gate, the restricted gate, He's implying that in some respects and from, in some perspectives, following Him is not going to be easy. It's not going to be, it's going to be difficult at times to follow in His footsteps. And so you've got it in this sermon, and you've got it in other places in the gospel accounts where Jesus talked about that. Let me call your attention to a couple of those. How about Luke chapter 9? Luke chapter 9, verse 23. Then He said to them all, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Jesus, again, made it difficult for some when He said, look, if you want to follow me, here's what it's going to require. You're going to have to deny yourself. That may be the hardest thing to do for some people, to say no to self. We live in such a selfish, narcissistic society today. For people to deny self is completely foreign to their thinking, and to actually do it would be very difficult. But that's what Jesus calls upon His followers to do. How about Matthew chapter 10, beginning in verse 34? You want to talk about difficult teaching? Matthew 10, beginning in 34. Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it. That's some tough teaching. That's difficult. Jesus is saying that there may be times when following after me, when being a faithful citizen of my kingdom, might even require that some very close family relationships be severed. If in order to maintain family relationships, it requires you to be unfaithful to the Lord, then you've got to pick the Lord over family. We must obey God rather than men, the words of Acts 5 and verse 29. So when you think about teachings like that, you see that yes, sometimes in some circumstances it's going to be hard to follow the Lord. Difficult is the way that leads to life. Paul reminded people in the region of Galatia in Acts 14, verse 22. He said to them, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom. And that was true for a lot of folks back then who had to make sacrifices that often involved severing family ties because of what Jesus calls upon us to do and how He calls upon us to live. So Jesus says being a part of His kingdom is not easy. Now, you may be thinking, and it's a good question, if you are thinking it, how does that concept harmonize with passages like Matthew chapter 11, verse 30, a passage we've quoted in this series of lessons and looked at? How does that harmonize with His words in Matthew 11:30 where He said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light? We've just spent a few minutes talking about how following Jesus is hard, how becoming a part of His kingdom is not easy, that it may require major sacrifices and difficult, tough decisions, gut-wrenching decisions. So how do you harmonize that whole concept with Jesus Himself saying, my yoke is easy and my burden is light? Well, the answer lies in the nature of the comparison. In other words, Jesus was not saying in Matthew 11:30 that following Him would remove all challenges, following Him would remove all obstacles, following Him would remove all problems, following Him would remove all challenges. He wasn't saying that at all in that passage. But what we're seeing there is that in comparison to the burden associated with sin, the burden that's laid onto us by sin, compared with the burden, if you will, of following Jesus, there's really no comparison. You see, Jesus in that context of Matthew chapter 11 was saying, and had previously said in 28 and following, "Come to me." He invited all those who were burdened down. All you who labor and are heavy laden, burdened down, come to me and I'll give you rest. So He's talking about people who are carrying a burden of sin. And when you compare the burden that sin is with the yoke that Jesus offers, there's really no comparison. The way of the transgressor is hard. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 15. And when you compare the way of the transgressor and everything that goes with carrying the burden and shackles of sin versus the responsibilities that come with embracing Jesus, there's no comparison. His burden is light and His yoke is easy compared to the burden that you bring to Him when you're carrying to Him your sins and all of the consequences and guilt of that. So entrance into the kingdom is going to be accompanied by personal sacrifice. There's no question about that. But the reward of being in the kingdom, life, eternal life, is going to be and is worth any sacrifice. Jesus said, "I came that they might have life, that they might have it more abundantly." John 10, verse 10. He came to give eternal life to all those who put their faith and trust in Him. John chapter 3. Verse 16. And so Jesus is offering life. And whatever it takes for us to sacrifice things in this life in order to enjoy that life, it's worth the sacrifice, it's worth the burden. But the tragedy is, few will make that choice. We go back to our text in Matthew chapter 7, and he says that few will find it. End of verse 14, the narrow gate, the difficult way that leads to life. Jesus said few will find it. And what we see throughout history is that that's exactly the case. Even in the days of Jesus when He was walking the earth, in John chapter 5, you see an example of that, of people who experienced Jesus firsthand, and yet they did not choose to follow Him. John chapter 5, verse 40, He simply says to them, "But you are not willing to come to me that you may have life." He had said in the previous verse, John 5, verse 39, to those that were His listening to Him that day, He said, "You search the Scriptures, and in them you think you have eternal life, but they are they which testify of me." Those Scriptures that you read testify of me. But you won't come to me, that you might have life. And so what was true then is still true today with a lot of folks. Jesus offers life, but it's offered through a difficult way and a narrow gate. And because it's a narrow gate and a difficult way, few people are willing to choose that way. And so it's in that sense that entering into the kingdom is not easy. And following Jesus is not easy. But in the second place, being lost is easy. And He indicates that by the words that He uses, specifically in verse 13, when He says, "Wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many go in thereat." And so when you talk about being lost, you're talking about entering a wide gate and a broad way. Those are terms that indicate its spaciousness and its ease of travel. You see, it's easy to let the world do your thinking for you. It's easy to just follow along with the crowd and fall in line with everybody else. It's easy to go through life without rocking the boat. It's easy to go through life and just blend in with everyone else. It's easy to be your own boss and just call the shots for yourself. It's easy to say, you know what, I don't care what anybody else thinks, I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to be true to myself and live that way. That's the easy way to live. Someone has well said, to be lost requires no sacrifice, but only indulgence. And how true that is. When Jesus talked about the way that leads to life, He said it's narrow and it's difficult. It's going to require sacrifice. But to be lost, to enter through the wide gate that's accessed through a very broad and spacious way, that doesn't require sacrifice. All that requires is for you to indulge yourself, to simply let your passions and your desires guide your every step, to not care or be concerned about God's will and His Word. To be lost simply requires that you do whatever it is you want to do. And that's what many people choose, but it's a way that leads to destruction. Now, the decision ultimately as to where we end up, that decision lies with us. When you look at verse 13 of chapter 7, it begins with Jesus saying, using the word enter. And that word enter is an imperative. It's a command. He's saying, you enter this way. Now, the fact that He issues that as a command is indicative of the fact that the choice is ours. He's told us, here's the way to go. Now, He's not going to force us to do that. He's not going to make us do it, but He's giving us the choice and telling us which way we need to go, but the choice is going to be up to us. So we have to decide to enter the kingdom. If you want to be a part of the kingdom, be a citizen in it, then the decision is going to be yours. In other words, you're not going to be a citizen of the kingdom of Christ either by accident or simply because you've inherited that status perhaps from your parents, some people think, or because you're associated with people, friends who are members of the kingdom. Now that's not going to make you a part of the kingdom. Some people think that they can ride into glory on the coattails of their parents, because thinking, well, my parents were Christians, and that's enough. I can make it in on their Christianity. Well, that's just not the case. Each individual ultimately is going to have to make up his own mind as to whether or not he enters the kingdom. And so, in a very real way, and ultimately, those who are lost, when the affairs of this life are wrapped up, and eternity is here, those who are lost then will have been lost because they chose to be. Because the kingdom to which we enter, whether it's the Lord's kingdom or Satan's, is going to be because we've chosen which way we're going to go. We're going to choose the broad way, we're going to choose the narrow way. The choice is going to be ours. So those that are lost ultimately are going to be lost because that's what they've chosen. We looked in previous lessons about this at this point, and I'll emphasize it again here. There's enough evidence in the world for people to reach the conclusion that there's a God and that they therefore should seek God. Paul in Acts 27 said that's why God created us. He created from one man all the nations of men that dwell on the earth so that they should seek Him in hopes that they might find Him, though He's not far from any one of us. So that's why we are here, to seek God and to find God and to honor and glorify Him. And there's enough evidence for people to reach the conclusion that there is a God if they properly assess what they're seeing in the world around them. Romans chapter 1 verse 20 makes that point. Paul does in very clear terms. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Think about the words of Psalm 19, verses 1 through 4, which make a similar case. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows His handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. So that passage teaches that as you gaze into the heavens, he says the heavens declare the glory of God. The expanse shows God's handiwork. And he says day after day and night after night, those things utter words in a sense. They utter speech. There is no language where that voice is not heard. His point is there's no place on earth where you can go where you can't see that evidence of God's majesty and glory through the created things, through the created world, the created order. And that was Paul's message in Romans 1:20. Those who reject God in favor of idolatry, he said those people are without excuse. They don't have any reason to do that because the invisible attributes of God are clearly seen as we perceive them through the things that God made. And so there's enough evidence in the created world for people to reach the accurate conclusion there is a God that needs to be sought. Now, a person wants to know what they have to do in order to be pleasing to God, then they're going to need more than the revelation, the general revelation that comes through creation. They're going to need to consult God's verbal revelation, His Word. But the point is, we can know that there is a God and know that He must be sought through just being observant of the things around us. He is not far from any one of us. Acts 17:27. He's available and accessible. A point we studied about in a previous lesson about the nature of God, that He is accessible. He doesn't turn a deaf ear to those who sincerely reach out to Him. And so when you and I make it to the other side, we're going to be where we have chosen to be. Have we listened to the evidence around us and reasoned correctly about it and sought the God who is? Or have we chosen the other way? Well, we'll be where we've chosen to be in eternity. And so let me leave you in this session with Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 19 and 20. Deuteronomy 30, verses 19 and 20, which I think is a good passage that kind of wraps up this whole idea about there being two ways that are available to us and the fact that we have a choice as to which way we take. Deuteronomy 30, beginning in 19. I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live, that you may love the Lord your God, that you may obey His voice, and that you may cling to Him. For He is your life and the length of your days, and that you may dwell in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. These were Moses' parting words to the people. And he said, here it is. He said, I've set before you two ways. I've set before you life and death, blessing, cursing. Choose life. And that's essentially what Jesus has said in His message. You want to be a citizen of His kingdom? Then I've set before you two ways, a broad way that leads to destruction, a narrow way that leads to life. You enter by the narrow gate. That's my admonition to you.
This is a production of World Video Bible School.